So welcome to the Idaho Commission for Libraries Info to Go session on Making Readers, How the Maker Movement Can Impact Literacy. Our presenter today is Megan Egbert from the Meridian Library District. My name is Gina Persicini. I'm the Continuing Education Consultant at the Idaho Commission for Libraries. If you have ideas for programs like this for different topics that we can cover during our monthly Info to Go sessions, you can give me a call or send me an email at any time. I will share my email in the chat for you, so it's another way that you can get questions. You can also just put something in the chat, and I'll be sure to review that and keep an eye on it for Megan if questions come in. During the presentation, if you have a question, it'd be great if you could raise your hand. You can raise your hand using the icon at the top of the screen. Should be just about over the M in your display area if you're using a desktop or a laptop computer. And it looks like a person of an image of a tiny little person with their hand raised. So if you just click that once, it'll raise your hand. Click it again to lower your hand. And with that, I am going to mute most of us and make sure that you can hear Megan.
Thanks, Gina. So this presentation was originally created for an ALSC webinar that I did, which is the Association for Library Services to Children, a branch of ALA. And I later converted it to a presentation for the 2016 ILA annual conference. So not this last conference, but the one before, way back. And ICFL asked me after that if I would consider doing it for an Info to Go session. And I said yes. I was so thrilled and honored that they asked me to do it. But believe it or not, it took us this long to actually make it happen, mostly because of delays on my part and just a busy schedule. So if you have seen my previous webinar or if you were at that ILA session, it is the same presentation pretty much. But the really nice thing about this topic is I've realized every single time I've talked about it, I have learned so much from the audience. And so I really do want to encourage you that if you have any ideas or inspirations during this presentation, please don't be afraid to chat them or follow up with me afterwards as well. So as Gina said, my name is Megan Egbert, and I am the District Programs Manager for the Meridian Library District. I got involved with making all the way back in 2013, thanks to the Idaho Commission for Libraries, when my library was selected as one of the very first libraries to go through the Make It at the Library cohort. I was a very reluctant maker. I like to describe myself. Our first 2 days of training, I constantly was asking myself, what did I get into? I felt like it was way over my head. I'm a self-proclaimed, artist at heart, and I had a hard time learning a lot of the stuff that they were asking us to learn. But throughout my experiences and over the years, I've become now what I call a maker enthusiast. And a few years ago, I got asked by the Children's Museum in Pittsburgh to speak on a panel about making and literacy. And I got really excited and I said yes. And then about 5 minutes later, I thought, I don't know anything about making and literacy, the two of them combined. So I did what any good librarian would do, and I faked my way through it with a lot of research. And I went to the panel, and I learned so much from the audience and from the other speakers, too, about making and literacy. And it became a bit of a passion project for me, and I decided I need to dig deeper into this. And one of the ways that I usually do that is by presenting on something that will force me to do a little bit deeper dive into the subject. So some of the things I found out when I was on that panel were really simple, right? I heard from schools or libraries who talked about that by implementing a makerspace in their library or school, all of a sudden they had all these kids in there reading during their lunch break. And they started asking themselves, what has changed besides the makerspace? And they were making it really complicated, trying to think of ways to measure the differences and the changes. And then one of the principals told me, and then we realized that they were all reading Arduino manuals because they were so embedded in these projects they were working on that they wanted to get ahead. And that was their motivation, and that's what they were doing. And some of the things I learned while on this panel and then following up to it as well were a little bit more complicated than that. And that's what I'll mostly be focusing on today is what are the intersections of literacy and making that we might not be thinking about, and how can we become more intentional and really utilize those in our own libraries. So before I get too far, I just wanted to do a brief overview of what making is, since there's lots of definitions out there. And all of you are obviously interested in the topic, and so you probably have your own definition of making, or your own idea at least, which is great. I would encourage you to always think back to that, but also always be willing to change. My own definition of what making is has certainly changed over the years. But these are the things that have really stuck out to me that are the most important. So making means that it's participant driven. So the participants get to make choices during the process and let their inquiry guide them. Open-ended means that there isn't one right way to do something, one right thing to build, or one right answer to a problem. Students are actually constructing their own answers. Social and shareable, so that social aspects help keep a really low barrier to making. So I could have also said that it just is fun, and that means that more people want to do it. They're not as intimidated. I like to give the example of, if we had somebody come into our library and there was a maker program happening, that they would be more likely to and willing to join it if it looked like it was fun and they didn't think they were going to interrupt the program if they just stumble in 15 minutes late, right? If it looks messy, if it looks like something that they can try and it doesn't matter if they mess up, then they're going to be more likely to try it. Then if they possibly stumbled upon a lecture of something that was happening, they're not going to walk in 15 minutes late. They're not going to try it if they don't have the background information that they need. And then making focuses on creation instead of consumption. So we're really focused on the process that goes along with that and the empowerment that comes from making something. So with that, what is not making? Whenever we talk about making, I think it's important to also talk about what's not making. This isn't to say that these things don't have value or shouldn't be done. For my own strategies, they just don't fit into the definition and goals of making that I want to accomplish. So close-ended projects. I've been guilty of this. I'm sure we all have. It's hard not to be guilty of this. Close-ended projects are the easy things to do when we're constructing programs. Whether it's painting, woodworking, or soldering, it's so much easier to say, this is what you're going to make today, and this is what you'll use to make it, right? This is your roadmap, these are your supplies, this is where you're going. It makes life a lot easier, but it isn't flexing these same maker muscles that we'll talk about in our next slide. And then making is not instructionism. I'm not going to get too far into instructionism, but you're all familiar with it because it's the status quo that we're used to in an educational setting. It is when one person, the instructor, has all the information and is standing before a lot of participants who are listening, and they're wanting to impart that information to the participants, right? It's what we think of as, in my previous example, of a lecture style. So that is not making. Crafting, this one can get like a little bit debated. I think there can be certainly aspects of crafting in making, but crafting usually is those closed-ended projects. Certainly still some important skills to have, but different. And then over-constructed. All these examples that I'm giving is basically when we are trying to make the experience for them rather than letting them determine their own experience through their learning. So why does it matter? Why does it matter if we're doing closed-ended projects or open-ended projects? Why can't we just instruct on what we know about and share our knowledge that way? Well, this is what we are trying to accomplish. Participants or patrons of our library who have a maker mentality. They're curious, they are gritty, they participate, and they have fun doing so. We know that people learn better and absorb information better and are more likely to stick with something if they are having fun. So how are making and literacy alike? Why should they go hand in hand? The more I started to dive into the subject, the more I started realizing some similarities that I was already doing between the two activities. So I'll give you an example. I have many ways that I would instruct parents when I'm talking about early literacy. For example, in an Every Child Ready to Read class. And it usually revolved around what their role was. And we would tell them that we wanted them to be a play extender, which means we don't want them to just play with their kids. We want them to find ways to extend whatever activity they were doing by asking open-ended questions, introducing new vocabulary words. And similarly, when I would talk to parents or educators about facilitating making experiences, the same phrases kept coming to mind. Instead of simply asking, "Did you like this?" we want them to ask questions like, "Why do you think this happened?" So I started to see a similarity in the role of facilitator for both these experiences, that really what we're wanting them to do is get to a deeper level of learning, and that the actions that we do around that are very similar. So today we're going to talk about a few different ways that literacy and making can be combined. We're going to highlight collections and ways that libraries can start to examine their collections and see if there's ways that they can infuse making throughout those. We're going to talk about programs, we're going to talk about spaces, and we're going to talk a little bit about transliteracy as well. So we'll start with collections. Collections are what people often think of when they think of the library, right? And even though I have nothing to do with our collections as the district programs manager, I still realize that there's many opportunities where we can kind of embed ideas about making into our collections. So I'm going to hit on a few different types of stories, and if you guys have examples of other ones you think fit into this, I would love to hear about them. I actually have a master list too of for a program we do, Maker Storytime, of books that we use. So a lot of these will focus on kind of younger years, but really any ages too. So these are just a few examples of what I call building stories. Building stories focus around books that encourage children to make something. So building stories are great, and can be used just for inspiration, or you can actually have people participate while you're reading them a story and essentially build along with the book. I do that a lot with the first one there on Jack the Builder, because there's a kid who's actually building with blocks in it, and letting kids actually build during a story, I think, changes the whole experience for them as well. Not a Box, Boy and Bot, just a few other examples. I'm sure other people have other building stories that they love. We could spend a lot of time on that one, and if you do think of one, please do add it in. Ideation stories are stories that really foster things like design thinking. So they're more about the idea than they are about an actual making process. So Rosie Revere, engineer, Iggy Peck, architect, and What Do You Do With an Idea are some of my favorite ones for that. So I might use these as a warm-up, like before any sort of maker program. And in all of these stories, you'll notice that they have some great tales of kids who fail horribly and really have to persist through that failure before they find any level of success. And I think that that's really important to emphasize when we're talking about making, because there's going to be a lot of failure. And it's actually intentional. We want there to be. It's something that we call desirable difficulties, which means that it's difficult enough that they're going to commit the learning to memory, right? So we know the failure is important. We know that we want them to fail, but that's really hard if you're not used to that. And so sometimes they need these ideas and these examples of how to do that. Concept stories, I think we're seeing a lot more of these, and I could actually even add to this list now that it's been over a year since I've last talked about this, but concept stories are ones that actually address a maker activity, but kind of in a fun, fictionalized way. So for example, the SMART books, the SMART stands for Science, Maker, and Real Technology Students. These are fictionalized stories like Smarts and the 3D Danger, Smarts and the Invisible Robot. They're available through Capstone. Secret Coders is one of my favorite series, and it teaches kids really hard concepts like binary. It's actually the only time I've maybe ever understood anything about binary was through this group, through this book and the pictures and these birds that are in it and the great way that they teach binary through them. So it has lots of computational thinking, but in the most creative ways imaginable. Leo and the Maker Prince is actually a picture book that actually introduces 3D printing through a story. It kind of takes the reader on an adventure around 3D printing. And then, of course, there are kits. So back in 2013, I was presenting at ALA conference about the idea of creating makers instead of spaces. And someone in the audience asked a question that sparked years of creativity for my library and many others who followed. And they just said, do you ever circulate any of your maker materials? And it seemed like common sense as soon as she said it, and I thought about it for days. But I had never thought about it before. We hosted lots of maker programs, and we frequently had, participants who did not have enough time to finish their project. But we had not thought about circulating any of our stuff. So when I got back, we started brainstorming kind of within our leadership team and thinking it over. And it made a lot of sense because as we started doing more making, we had really beefed up our nonfiction collection around, robotics and Raspberry Pis and Arduinos and circuits and all of that type of stuff, and none of them were circulating. And I thought, well, yeah, why would anybody check out the book if they don't have the actual item? So we started looking at ways that we can combine physical maker items with print resources and then some curated digital online resources as well. So back then in 2013, we started what we called Make It, Take It kits. We've since retired these, but we did have a ton of success with them. We had everything from Arduinos to robots that we checked out. And we have probably talked to over 100 libraries in the aftermath who wanted to do something similar and have tried to help them troubleshoot. And that was great too, because we were able to learn something from each one of them. And one of my favorites actually was the Carnegie Library of Pittsburgh contacted me, and we had great conversations. And they had kits that they were using just for programming internally between their libraries, that they were maker kits. And they had an intern who they had create instructions for the kit, but they created them totally as a graphic novel format. So it's really fun and interesting to read the instructions. I thought, oh, maybe even I would read the instructions if they were this entertaining. So I just love that one example of how they found a way to kind of incorporate literacy into it as well.
Megan?
Yeah, I see another question there. Why are the kits retired?
Yeah.
That's a great question. I am no longer involved with the collection side of things anymore. I think, though I can still speak to probably why they're retired, we gave them a long run. It was just a few months ago, actually, that we retired them. So from 2013 to 2017, we had a lot of different kinds. I think it just got to the point where our library of things has really evolved. We circulate a lot of things, and it got a little complicated and a little too hard to manage with how many things we were circulating. So we're trying to really figure out the future for our library of things and what do we want to circulate. I think a different version of them will come back. We're just really in the evaluation phase to figure out, one of the challenges was waitlist for sure, because when we would release a new one, it would become really popular. but then it immediately had such a long wait list that we'd have to do multiples of them. So it just became a lot to manage. All good things, I think, a great learning experience. And as I said, I think we'll see another version come back. So that's a good question, though. Okay, so as the programs manager, I focus a lot on programs. So I just want to hit on a few of those too, and some different ways that making and literacy can become intertwined. So I talked a little bit about Maker Storytime. We had a Maker Storytime here at the library that we actually hosted at our emerging technology library called Unbound. But I learned about this concept from the Children's Museum of Pittsburgh when I was there presenting, and they were great because they shared a lot of their resources with me as well. So we would offer our Maker Storytime concurrently to our Moms Who Code program. So mothers with young children could have some time to work on a project while their kids were engaged in similar but scaled activities. So the idea behind a Maker Storytime is to introduce a maker concept or project through stories and really to use those stories as a bridge into an activity. So for example, Storytime might focus around circuits. The books we read don't necessarily have to be around circuits, and I probably wouldn't want them to be because that sounds horribly boring, but maybe they focus more on ideation. We would combine the concept of ideation with activities at the end where kids could practice having an idea by creating something that lights up or something that is conductive. So there's many different ways that Maker Storytimes can be done, just like there's many regular ways, or there's many different ways that regular Storytimes can be done. But the idea is that the books can act as this bridge into making. And I'll give you one example here if this is the actual program outline that I used for Maker Storytime. So the theme of this Storytime was robots. You can see the books used were Awesome Dawson, Spare Parts, and Fix This Mess. We had a song that was If You're a Robot, similar to If You're Happy and You Know It. We had a building component, which is where they had to create an idea of a robot with straws and connectors. And then we actually moved into playing with some robots. We had the dot and dash robot. And there was, I think we had coloring sheets as well. So really similar to a regular story time, but just with a different focus, right? And we weren't really crafting at the end. We were doing more open-ended play and letting them explore this topic in a different way where they got to make a lot of choices as to what they would do too. So we also started rethinking some of our book clubs. We have not actually had a maker book club. I wish we would have successfully done one, but I did read about other libraries who have. One of them was really cool. They have a book club that was focused around steampunk novels. And after they read the book, they are all tasked with making something from the novel. So they tried to build functional things based off the ideas offered in the novel, and they try to take something from an abstract idea and make it real. And I love this idea of rethinking book club into more than just sharing a reading experience, but taking it to the next level of collaboration and then creating something meaningful to represent that experience. And even though we haven't had a maker book club, I will say we've been able to incorporate this into a lot of our other programs too, right? So we try to not create programs based around a single book anymore. I think instead what we're trying to do is look at, what we want to accomplish from the program, whether it's to, increase collaboration or creativity, or whether there's actual standards that we're hoping to meet by the program, and then look at how different books or stories or texts could play a role in that. So for example, my library was very fortunate to be one of the 25 libraries selected to get the ALA Ready to Code grant this year that was sponsored by Google. And when we were looking at the outcomes that we wanted to accomplish for that program, specifically for us, we were looking to attract girls ages 5 to 18 to come to these programs focused around computational thinking. As we started thinking, how can stories play a part in this? Not just in every program, but how can larger stories, how can books play a part of this? And so it was really fun to match books that the different ages actually got to take home as part of it. And that's where a lot of those concept stories came in. Girls Who Code books and the Smarts books, that we actually got to use those throughout the program too, to really enforce what we were trying to accomplish in the program as well. And then lots of places are kind of rethinking how they're doing robotics and seeing how stories can be more incorporated into that process. So when I was presenting in Pittsburgh, one of the fun things that somebody in the audience had talked about is, the age-old classroom assignment of dioramas, right? So you have to like read a book and then create a diorama to go with that book. And how what they had done was they had used the Ruminate toys, if you're familiar with those, that lets you kind of power, it lets you build a structure and then kind of power the structure. So you could build, you could build a house, but then you could actually like power the fans and stuff in it. They're great tools, but they used those so that they had to actually animate their dioramas, so they had to be functional and not just representative of the book that they had read. Some other great examples around this were the dash and dot robots that I showed a few minutes ago that we had used in Maker Storytime, that students had to actually create a play or a short story for dot and dash to reenact, because they're robots where you can record your voice. You can record your voice and actually program them to say certain things at certain times. So they had to recreate a scene from Shakespeare and make the robots recite the lines. And I just thought that that was a really creative way to think about using robots and to integrate some of those coding concepts that we know are so important into just a regular lesson that they need to learn anyways too. And recently, a local example, and I don't know all the details about it, but talking from the after school or out of school network, when they had done a coding competition, they had said one of the, or for different coding clubs or robotics clubs, one of their favorite entries had come from a local reservation who used their robots to tell the story of code talkers to honor their ancestors, and the way that they used their own history into the narrative of the story they wanted to tell through their robots, I thought was really inspiring as well. So many of the ways that literacy and making can be tied together revolve around this idea of transliteracy. So Sarah Scott, in Making the Case for a Public Library Makerspace, which is on Public Libraries Online, says, one of the traditional roles of the public library in society is facilitating the creation of knowledge in our communities. Promoting literacy through instruction has long been a part of a librarian's job. Today, the concept of literacy encompasses much more than just reading and writing. It has evolved into transliteracy, commonly defined as the ability to read, write, and interact across a range of platforms and tools. So this is what we're really talking about, is making as an educational practice that can allow students to navigate through platforms and develop literacy simultaneously to other learning that might take place. So if you're interested in this idea of transliteracy, here are some of my favorite resources. Laura Fleming, an educator in New Jersey, has a great blog called Worlds of Learning. And under her publications, she has written multiple articles about how transliteracy can be incorporated into the classroom or library. And there's a slide share if you want the quick and dirty explanation of what transliteracy looks like in the library. And although I don't think it's updated anymore, there is a link to it there. And this idea is not new by any means. I can't even remember when the slide share, the date on it, but it's several years ago. We're just now still talking about the same thing because I think the platforms continue to change, and so we're still evolving this idea of what literacy really looks like when the platforms continue to change. And lastly, libraries can tie making and literacy together through their spaces. So if you are a library fortunate enough to have a makerspace, and I realize many are not, then literacy can be embedded throughout the space. So in a few minutes, we'll discuss a makerspace that has done just that. But thanks to the Carnegie Library of Pittsburgh, I know that in the future, all of our spaces, I really want to have any instructions written in graphic novel format. So this is just a great infographic. The slide on your left is from Colleen Graves, also a school librarian who is just demonstrating for you the difference in circulation increase before she implemented a makerspace and after she implemented a makerspace in her school library. And then the quote on the right there from Laura Fleming, I think, talks a little bit about why, like why would we see that increase? And she talks a lot too about the main goal of her library makerspace is to support and promote literacy. And that can be traditional literacy like reading and writing and research, but that also means supporting students in digital literacy. So that's coding and invention. So we still want to get kids to love books and reading, but the makerspace is really an extension of that. So when students start inventing and creating, they often need to refer back to research or other projects or books. So maker-focused books are very close to their makerspace there as well to serve as a resource too. So here's just a few examples of how you can put all these things together. This is a video and it's long, it's 10 minutes long, so we're not going to watch it, but I am going to just share a link with you here that can kind of explain this project a little bit better too. I'll just share it in the chat here. But this is Monticello High School in Virginia, and the students were learning about the hero's journey, but instead of just writing an essay about the hero's journey, instead they had to create a Rube Goldberg machine to represent their hero's journey in the book that they had read. If you're unfamiliar with a Rube Goldberg machine, it's a hugely over-engineered chain reaction to do a simple task like turn off the lights. And it is a great video if you want to watch it as well. You can see how much learning really is going into this project and how often they refer back to the book. Even though they are dealing with difficult manipulatives like duct tape and rubber bands, and they're trying to orchestrate this whole chain reaction, they also keep going back to the hero in the book to talk about what the experience was like, and then to talk about how they could demonstrate that in a different way. If you're not familiar with Inanimate Alice, it's an interactive, multimodal, ongoing digital novel that follows Alice and her imaginary digital friend Brad in episodes, journals, and other digital media. If you haven't checked it out, I would strongly encourage you to do so. But I just wanted to focus on some ways that something like this, or Skeleton Creek, or other similar formats can be used to tie making and literacy together. So one educator with Inanimate Alice as the mentor text said that they worked with students to create postcards that characters in the story might send to the main character, Alice. And then using the Mozilla WebMaker tool Thimble, kids remixed the postcards into digital media and posted them on the web. So the tool allowed the children to remix their favorite digital postcards by modifying the HTML and CSS right in their browser. So they took this one text, this one situation, and they had a writing component to it by writing postcards. But because they were doing it in a digital format, they were also having to learn some HTML and some coding skills as well. And there's a great article that I read about this called Literacy in the Making. And it's actually by Laura Fleming that I mentioned earlier too. So putting it all together. So how can a library focus on their collection, their spaces, their programs, and transliteracy? So this is one like pie in the sky example, just so you know. I don't think anybody's going to immediately get to this, but it gives us some great inspiration. The new Hanover County Public Library received an LSTA grant in 2013-2014 to create Storyspace, a storytelling makerspace in the children's department of their main library, and this is in North Carolina. So this innovative new space opened in 2014 and was equipped with cutting-edge technology, a manipulative for parents to explore with their children while creating stories. Story plays promoted family interaction through storytelling and reading at several different stations. They had everything from music recording, filmmaking, animation, iPad stations for story creation, printing and reading, flannel board stations, puppetry, and interactive panels. The whole idea behind this makerspace was to create the shared learning experience for families with a variety of different formats. So it is part of their regular library. It's staffed by regular library staff, but they really wanted the families to be able to explore and create their own stories on their own as well. Just a few other publications I have about this topic too. If you're interested, I do have a book called Creating Makers that came out in July of 2016 with Libraries Unlimited, where I focus quite a bit on the ideas of literacy and making and how they can be combined. I also wrote for YALSA's publication of YALS, How Libraries Can Do It All, Making Literacy and College Career Readiness. Some ideas of how those things can be combined as well. Because I understand that feeling sometimes of, wait, we're supposed to be teaching people how to read and love reading and making and doing everything. And it can get complicated, I agree. But at the heart of both making and literacy are some very common things, as we've already talked about. One big common denominator that we didn't cover is also the role of the librarian in both these realms. I believe it's our job, whether it's literacy or making, to find new and innovative ways to spark curiosity and then break down barriers so that participants can follow that path of learning. Research has shown that when we are curious about something, we learn better, and not just while we're working on that one item that we're curious about, but in the hours to follow as well. Curiosity is the key to both of these areas, and it's the key for librarians to focus on to tie them together as well. And then I just wanted to give one more resource here as well. Maker Literacy is a book that actually came out in November of 2016, and I still have not gotten a copy of it yet, but I really want to, and I've had it on hold for quite a while. But I just wanted to point out that clearly this is a popular topic that everybody is interested in realizing that there is a lot of excitement and there's a lot of motion moving around the maker movement right now, and really thinking about how can we use that to impact literacy and how can we use that to encourage the love of stories and reading as well. So I look forward to when I hopefully get this book and can read it and can have even more ideas as well. So I talked pretty quickly through that, but I would love to take some questions since we do actually have some time here. And as Gina said, you can raise your hand. I think she's going to work on unmuting people. You can chat ideas or questions as well, too.
Okay, if you have any questions for Megan, just go ahead and raise your hand, or you can type them in the chat box. To raise your hand, there's an image of a person at the top of the screen. Click that once to raise your hand. Click it again to lower it. So Megan, while folks are thinking,
Yeah.
in the beginning you talked about the open-ended aspect of making and that there's no correct answer to things. And I wonder if you get pushback on that from people who are new to the making idea and how you deal with that.
Oh, I would say probably I even pushed back on that at the beginning. And what I would say is that I don't think that it means there's not room for those things that do have, you know, like one really good example I think is I would not just allow, you know, people in a program to like go nuts with soldering if they've never done soldering before, right? Like that's not a safe best practice and it doesn't make much sense. So there's still room for like the close-ended aspects of it. Like if you're soldering, there's a very specific order to how you're going to need to learn some of the skills before you can have that kind of creative availability to do whatever you want with it. So I think there's still room for it. I think we just have to be really intentional about how many decisions we're letting participants make during the process, and we always want to optimize that as much as we can, but sometimes it's not feasible.
Got to unmute myself. That makes sense to me. And I see that we have Jared typing a question in.
Hi, Jared. What is your elevator speech to the public as to why making belongs in a library? I think it depends on how many floors we're going and how long they have. But I think really it revolves around that libraries have always been a place where people can access information, and that we need to continue to do that. And information just comes in a variety of formats now. So it's, I think, essential that the library evolves in the formats that we allow opportunities to explore too. So yeah, mostly around that. And then a lot just around the curiosity piece too. I think that's where my focus has really gone, is if we are educational institutions and if what we care about is kids learning, then it's really important that we find that that learning can be delivered in a way that's going to spark their curiosity and maintain it too. And I have personally witnessed that with making. I've seen kids who probably would never be described as good students. I've seen them really get captivated and empowered by making something. The part that I didn't talk about was a lot of the research that has gone into making so far has tried to look at, what difference does it make, right? So is it just STEM subjects that we increase our knowledge in with making? And what they found, a lot of this is out of Harvard Project Zero too, is that what we can say for sure happens when people go through the maker experience is that they have something called maker empowerment, which means, and I think we can all kind of visualize this, that if a student creates something and has an opportunity to share that, they feel this sense of pride that they don't have necessarily otherwise. And the more that it comes from them and the less that it comes from the facilitator, I think really increases that too. So I would also tie it all back to how people learn, and that this is just one way that seems to be really successful for a lot who have probably struggled to learn in other environments, and that's why it becomes increasingly important for libraries to offer making as well. So that's a long elevator ride, obviously.
Any other questions or comments for Megan? Well, I would like to thank everyone for coming, and before you...
There is one more there, Gina. Hold on.
Oh, please go ahead.
Yeah, it's a really good one, Leanne. Our kids want to keep their creations utilizing library resources. Sometimes this isn't an option, but other times it's too costly. How do you address this? It's really challenging. It's a lot easier, obviously, if you have grant funding and they can keep the resources, but that's not often. So when it's not going to be the case, I try to really focus more on collaborative group projects, because I think there's a little bit less ownership then. They might have built a piece of something and they seem to understand that better, that they can't just keep a piece of this project. So I think really looking at project-based learning for some of those when you know that there's no way they can keep it, or see if there is a scalable skill. I've encountered this before with, like, if we're talking about e-textiles, like it's easy and pretty cheap for them to be able to make like just a simple bracelet or bookmark that lights up. It's a lot more complicated if we're talking about that there needs to be some sort of programming in place with like a LilyPad Arduino or something. We can't afford to send them with one of those. So I think focusing on the scalable part of it that they could take home is another idea for those type of things. And then just kind of introducing the idea of the larger thing that they're not going to be able to take home, so that it's not the emphasis, if it's that important, that they want to take something home.
Thanks, Leanne, for that question and for all the information. that you guys are sharing with us. Well, with nothing more, I do want to share some information about our Info2Go program. Info2Go takes place every month, and our next one will be in February on the 26th, on a Monday. And Info2Go is something we are able to do with thanks from the Library Services and Technology Act, LSTA funds, that come through the Institute of Museum and Library Services. And join us again February 26th for a session from the Idaho Digital Learning Academy. They're going to talk about Idaho's Parent Education Resource Center, and you can register for that and any of the Info2Go sessions planned for this year at libraries.idaho.gov/info2go. And thank you, Megan, so much. This was a fantastic presentation. And to all those who are present, you'll get an email from us with a request that you fill out an evaluation to give us some more ideas and tell us how we can do more with Info2Go. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, Gina.